Hello and welcome to episode 20 of Market Values, the Transfermarkt podcast that strives to break down the biggest stories in the world of football every single week, and along the way, discussing the market values on our website. We are currently traversing the choppy waters of the transfer window, and there's a lot of news happening, but remarkably, the World Cup still has its claws in us and is dragging us back to discuss more international football. There were two huge managerial appointments in the world of international football, and we're going to discuss both of them on this week's show. However, we also have to discuss what's going on around the world of football domestically. And while there are transfer stories going on around the world, some big moves, particularly in the Premier League, where unprecedented amount of money is being spent, Manu and I wanted to sit down and shine a light on some young players who could maybe not make a move, perhaps make a move, but certainly improve their standing. And Manu, great to have you back on the show. I just realized I haven't even introduced you. As always, my co-host Manu Ver is with me here. And we're going to dive straight into a section that I have decided to call 6 under 21s, under 21 million euros of market value. I'll maybe in post-edit try and think of a better title for that. But Manu, the gist of this is you've picked 3 players under the age of 21 whose market value is under 21. I've picked 3 players who've also under the age of 21 with an under 21 market value. And the whole gist of this is us saying we think each of these players' market values are going to go up. They'll hopefully go above 21 million euros, but probably significantly higher than that. And do you know what? I'll let you kick things off with your first player if you want.
Yeah, I'm going to go to Australia via Colorado via Germany. This is a young Australian centre back, Lucas Harrington. He plays for the Colorado Rapids. And to be honest, Stefan, what a pickup by them. They signed him from Brisbane for a very small transfer fee ahead of this MLS season. And then he plays for Australia at the World Cup. He picked up a German passport, which can be significant depending on where he goes next, because he is going to go somewhere else next after playing a very good World Cup. His market value at the World Cup exploded. It went from when he first joined the Rapids, it was 1.5 million. It has since gone up to 8 million euros. And that is because we anticipate on the back of this World Cup, he's probably going to very rapidly leave Major League Soccer and to go to a European top 5 league club. He's currently linked with Bayern Munich, Chelsea, Manchester City, Manchester United, AC Milan, Barcelona, who were first in on him. That was around before the World Cup started. And then unfortunately, he played the World Cup. Unfortunately for them, he played the World Cup, and lots of other people noticed that there's a very talented centre back playing in MLS, who's probably way too good for MLS at the age of 18 already. And I think, he's a meter 93, plays beyond his age already. Has shown at the World Cup stage that he can play at the stage already. Is one of the most valuable Australians. And I think he has the potential to become one of the most valuable Australians. Maybe even become one of those really, really top defenders. And if you haven't heard about Lucas Harrington yet, I think you will very soon, because the links to all those top clubs is definitely accurate. And if they are interested in a player like him, then, you just know that they're onto something, right? Harrington, Lucas Harrington, remember the name.
I'm just looking at his market value timeline, Manu, and it's been a really remarkable rise in the space of 12 months. Like in January 2025, he had a market value of 125,000 euros. That's when, obviously, as you said, he was a Brisbane Roar. But since he's made the move to MLS, it's gone from 750k to 8 million euros. As you said, obviously, a huge amount of interest in him, but is that because of his profile, or has he already shown in those 16 games in MLS that this kid's already too good for MLS? He's going to be in Europe before too long.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely too good for MLS already. it's Australia is a really interesting market. I spoke to some people that work in Australian football, and there's a lot of transfers that are currently happening between the A League and MLS because the salaries in A League are very low and the talent pool is quite high. So A League players see MLS as a stepping stone club for Europe, right? Because the European clubs are paying more attention to MLS than they do to A League clubs. There's the infrastructure in the United States is far better for football than it is in Australia as well. So young kids are willing to make this step because they instantly get a significant increase in salary. And then the level in MLS is a lot higher. And this is not my opinion. This is the opinion I speak to people, agents who work in Australian football. And now I'm facilitating all these players to go to MLS instead for their development. So it's become a really interesting market and it's paying off. He's a great example of that. Colorado picked him up for 900,000 euros. And they're going to make a significant transfer profit on him very fast, right? But it is definitely, I think that's a trend that you can watch. There's already been the Golden Boot scorer, Golden Boot winner of the A League has already moved to MLS this summer, Jovanovic, right, to the San Jose Earthquakes, again, for a very small fee, and I'm pretty sure the Earthquakes are going to cash him in really quickly. But it's a trend that is interesting to watch because I think it's going to be something that we're going, this Australia to US to Europe pipeline is something that we're going to see more often now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really interesting one. Certainly want to keep an eye on. I'm sure our listeners in in England or across Europe will probably be aware of him when his name starts to creep across like the BBC rumor mill or something along those lines, and you'll be able to say, I heard that on the Market Value podcast back in July. My first player on this list is playing in Denmark, a Ghanaian midfielder called Caleb Yirenkyi. And I picked him because he's 20 years old, so he is under 21, and he has a market value of 18 million euros. But it's also worth noting that his market value very recently increased. It actually increased by 8 million euros to 18 million euros. Sorry, increased by 80% to 18 million euros. Due to the fact that he obviously was a starter for Ghana at the World Cup. But in a weird way, even though, a 20-year-old playing for his country, the World Cup is such an important part of the development, I also think he is just on the cusp of, he's on the cusp of greatness. Not to kind of put too heavy word on it, but he's absolutely rattling through the Danish Super League. He made the move to Nordsjælland from the Right to Dream Academy, which is obviously a very well-trodden path. For anyone who doesn't know, Nordsjælland have this kind of, I don't know how to describe it, Manu, if it's like a kind of commercial partnership or if they're owned by Nordsjælland. I maybe need to look into that. But a number of players have come from the academy in Ghana and went on to play for the Danish club. And Yirenkyi's the latest example of that. He joined the club for free in January 2024. And his market value has just kind of steadily increased to 18 million euros along the way. And I think what's really interesting about him is that he started off as a central defender, and if you actually look at his stats for Nordsjælland now, he's actually more of a kind of attacking central midfielder. Maybe it's just because he's obviously too good for the Super League already in Denmark, but he's scoring and creating goals for fun. He's a fantastic dribbler with the ball, and he's just proving to be a really, really good kind of box-to-box player because obviously he can defend because he has that grounding as a central defender, but also is showing in Denmark that he could be an attacking asset as well. And to no great surprise, he's already been linked to a number of clubs. And I think the ones that be worth interesting in, he's been linked to Chelsea, he's been linked to Real Madrid, and I think we can kind of take that with a pinch of salt because Real Madrid aren't really in the market of kind of scooping up players from the Danish first tier. Maybe they will, but I'm not quite expecting it. I think the one that's more interesting though is that he's been linked to Porto and Strasbourg as well. And I think those are two clubs that I could very, very easily see him going to before the end of this transfer window. So Yirenkyi, he's at 18 million euros right now. He's on the cusp of being above 21 million euros, but I suspect a big move before the summer will take him over that figure. And if not, I suspect he's just going to see that market value continue to rise up as he continues to perform in Danish football.
Yeah, he's part of the Right to Dream Academy, right? Which it has, grown significantly, owned by an Egyptian billionaire. the entire setup. They've sent players to all over the world. They also own the team in MLS, San Diego FC, where they've also sent players to. It's a really interesting kind of concept where they develop players in their Right to Dream academies that are based all over the world, and then just funnel them through Denmark, and then release them to develop all over the world. It's I think it's something that you're going to see more increasingly with some of these smaller clubs that have to think about the box. But North Zealand is a really good club to develop. I mean, they have brought out some really good players over the last few years, and Scandinavia in general has been a really good place for these African kids to develop and use that sort of as a springboard to go to a big European league. And Yirenkyi, he looks like a star in the making, Stefan.
Yeah, without a doubt. I think you hit the nail on the head there in terms of Scandinavian football, and it's only something I really began to appreciate when I started working at Transfermarkt, and you kind of get a wider scope of European football as a whole. And I've done a few pieces for Transfermarkt over the years looking at which leagues provide the best game time for under 21 players. And yes, you have your Dutch Eredivisie and your Belgian Jupiler Pro leagues and your Liga Portugals, but the Scandinavian leagues are, over the course of the last kind of 4 or 5 years, have quickly risen to the top of those tables, and they're running away with it, to be honest with you. It's obviously not just, homegrown players like you can probably name a number of players from Denmark or Norway or Sweden, but it's also foreign players who they sign from, as you said, like these kind of academies like Right to Dream, who are all thriving because it's a league that just gives a lot of players game time. And so it's a very, very fun league to keep an eye on. And Yirenkyi is just the latest example of that. And I think he's going to be a star. And I think we're probably going to be talking about him at Strasbourg, potentially moving to a Liverpool or a Tottenham in 12 months' time. I really wouldn't be surprised. So, yeah, that's my first player. Who's your second on the list, Manu?
We're going to stay in Africa via MLS again. And that's Mbekezeli Mbokazi. Mbekezeli Mbokazi. That's a mouthful. You better start remembering his name. He plays for the Chicago Fire. The Chicago Fire signed him from South Africa, from the South African first division there, from Orlando Pirates. Long story short, it's a very similar story to Australia, that MLS clubs are currently going a lot to South Africa because they can just outmuscle these teams financially, and they're scooping up these young players and developing them with an eye to looking to sell them. Mbokazi is actually one of the most popular players in MLS. He has a massive social media following in South Africa. So when he arrived, the Chicago Fire were almost overwhelmed with the amount of interest that they received in this player, but had a great World Cup. Saw his market value go up to 8 million euros. Is currently linked to Galatasaray, Napoli, Nottingham Forest, and Wolverhampton Wanderers. I've been told by sources that they expect a transfer fee between 10 and 12 million dollars, US dollars. So that 8 million euro fee on our part is still a little bit conservative. I can shed some light on why when we did the World Cup market value update, why we stayed conservative is because his height, he's only 1.77 meters. That is a little bit one where I'm like, is he physical, tall enough? We spoke about Lucas Harrington, he's 1.95 meters. Does he have that physical element to play in the Premier League? I think that is something that we have to see.
For those of us who still use old money, that's 5'9" by the way.
It's not, but that is exactly what you mean, right? So that is something that I think could hold him back potentially. Having said that, I could still see someone like Galatasaray go and spend a lot of money. I could see someone like Napoli do it. Or I could see a very ambitious championship side sign him for a significant fee, right? And give him a try. He's a really good ball playing centre back. Helped South Africa reach the round of 32. And so, I think definitely a name to keep an eye on.
I was just checking there because I had a theory that he has played left back in the past. I wouldn't be surprised if that's a position that he moves into more naturally, because as you said, his height, it can be quite limiting. I mean, I know Kabasi just won player of the tournament at the World Cup, and he's relatively short centre defender, so he shows that you can be a young defender, a short defender, and still be a world-class player for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But he's really fascinating, Manu. Just, if anything, just because I remember old Football Manager saves where Orlando Pirates, for some reason, were a club that always developed fantastic young players. I can't remember which version of it is, but I used to have a Football Manager save where I would always check in on Orlando Pirates and some kind of regen would pop up every season. It would be amazing. But yeah, Mbokazi looks like a fascinating player. And as you said, he's been linked to a number of clubs. Do you think Chicago would sell him already this summer?
Yeah, I think if the right offer comes in, they definitely would. They are a club that is quite willing to move on assets if it's the right time. It's a big story right now. They signed Robert Lewandowski, right, as a free on a free transfer, and they got a big offer from Liga MX for Hugo Kuipers, the Belgium national team player, who plays for them and currently leads the Golden Boot race in MLS ahead of Lionel Messi. And it looks like they're going to accept that offer, right? Because they already have someone else in place. It's a team with links to Switzerland. They have a Swiss owner who also owns teams there. And so money is often at the forefront, Stefan, as it often is with the Swiss.
Yeah, well, I'm going to sidestep you, insult the entire nation there, move on to my second player. And it's technically, I'm going to pick this player, even though some people might roll their eyes that I've included them here. But this is, I'm going for Everton winger Tyler Dibling, who anyone who watches English football will know is a player who's already moved clubs for a substantial amount of money. He obviously moved from Southampton to Everton last year for 40.5 million euros, which everyone, I think, unanimously agreed was a tremendous amount of money for a player. His market value at the time was 25 million euros. It peaked at 35 million euros ahead of last season, which is primarily based off of that market, off that transfer fee, and admittedly his performances for Southampton in the Premier League. But he didn't get much game time at Everton at all last season, and his market value has now fallen below 21 million euros and is now sits at 17 million euros. So he's technically a candidate for this section. The reason I've picked Dibling is because I think he is an outstanding player. I remember watching him at Southampton and I thought, this kid looks like the next kind of Jack Grealish. He can dribble, he can pass. He took to the Premier League with such ease at Southampton. And I think he maybe made the wrong move to an extent in moving to Everton, only because they were a club who were struggling financially. So that transfer fee has kind of hung over him to a dramatic degree, because it obviously swallowed up a huge amount of the club's transfer budget. But they're also a club that had to kind of batten down the hatches and just avoid relegation, which is obviously what they did when they appointed David Moyes. And, Moyes, ever the pragmatist, really kind of struggled to find a place for Dibling in his team last season. However, I think this will change this season. I think after a good preseason under Moyes, Dibling will probably feature a lot more for Everton. He started in their first preseason friendly against Dundee, which they won 4-0, which was a good sign. And I think, despite the fact that Moyes does have this kind of pragmatic nature of being a head coach who's always hired to put out fires and pick up results first, he does have a tremendous record of developing young players throughout his career, especially at Everton, where he was the player who unearthed none other than Wayne Rooney. Now, I'm not saying Tyler Dibling is going to be the next Wayne Rooney, but I think he will become a first-team regular for Everton this season. And so I think we'll probably see his market value start to shoot back upwards towards that kind of 30, 35 million euro figure if he can kind of perform for Everton and show what I think he's already shown for Southampton. So, Manu, that's my second choice. And I know maybe technically, a player who's maybe already gone over that value but he's sunk back down to it, and I think he's going to rebound. But the only other interesting thing that's worth noting is that there has been some speculation of him potentially leaving Everton this summer, which I don't personally think is going to happen. But he has been linked to RB Leipzig, who, and I would argue that if he does move to Leipzig, you'll probably also see his market value rise because they'll find a space for him in their team.
Yeah, they might be selling a certain Yan Diomande, and a young Tyler J. Robert Dibling could step in nicely to help fill that void, get an enormous amount of minutes, play Champions League football, and you're quite right, his market value would go up instantly. It's a really good pick. I like it. It's not someone that you would think about right away. And
Yeah, well, and that's what I'm saying. He'll either play for Everton or he'll move to Leipzig and play for Leipzig. Either way, I think he's going to show up.
yeah, it's I think you're 100% right. Definitely a player to keep an eye on, for sure. Should I move to my next one?
Yeah, go for it.
I also need to make a quick correction about Chicago's ownership. It's an American ownership with heavy Swiss ties in Joe Mansuto. So let's correct that here before anyone goes down in the comment sections and yells at me.
We redact any derogatory comments about the Swiss because they don't actually own Chicago Fire.
I said nothing bad about the Swiss. It's just said that there's links to Switzerland. Anyways, moving on to this next player, and this is Luc De Fougerolles. He is Canadian, or rather represents Canada in the international level, was born in London, is another centre back. I swear to God, I didn't go on the Transfermarkt side and just pick centre backs. This is total coincidence. But he's another player who really used the World Cup as a stage to show what a good player he is. He's really fascinating because he played for Canada before he made a professional first team appearance on the club level. He's part of the Fulham Youth Academy, where he played pretty much most of his life. Was on loan in Belgium last year, where I think personally he made a huge step in his development. And then, of course, has now returned to Fulham. Curious to see what's going to happen there now, because the World Cup definitely showed that he can play on a big stage. He in my opinion, when Canada lost Ismail Kone, was their most influential, important player to a really horrible injury. He's one of the reasons why that team didn't collapse on itself, because what North American football still lacks is that ability with the first touch and making that measured play out of the back. And he has that obviously because he was taught to play in Europe, and he's so very tight. He can play left back, right back, both center back positions. Can also, on a pinch play in midfield. And we were sitting kind of together and thinking about who's going to be Canada's next big star. Who's going to emerge as Canada's next big star. And I think it's 100% him. Luc De Fougerolles is going to be a big star, playing and representing his country. I think the one thing that I'm really curious to see what's going to happen with him, because he's now, of course, returned from his loan to Fulham, and we have him listed in the Premier League 2 squad, the U21 squad. He's definitely too good for that now, Stefan. He needs to graduate from that level, right? Whether that is moving to an ambitious championship team or break through with Fulham themselves, right? Or go back to maybe like a Belgium, a Netherlands, a mid-table Bundesliga side, to sort of find that playing time. I hear that there were some links to Bundesliga teams. Freiburg have snooped around, for example, a little bit. That would be the sort of team that just gives him the trust and gives him the playing time so he can make that next step in his development. But yeah, I think the way he was just so very good and confident with the ball and represented Canada at the World Cup was hugely impressive for a 20-year-old.
Yeah, this is actually really interesting, kind of how his circumstances are beginning to maybe kind of click into gear, if you will, because he's returned to Fulham, where they have a new head coach. So he's going to obviously be looking at the squad with fresh eyes. And usually when a manager comes in, they're usually quite open-minded about players kind of proving themselves. But he's also returned to a Fulham side. And as you said, he's too good for the under-21s team. And I suspect Fulham will probably be looking at their first team squad and thinking, well, if there's a position where we definitely have to strengthen this summer, it is central defence, because he sold Isaac Diop to Ipswich for €10 million, and they've only got 3 central defenders on the books. That's Calvin Bassey, who's a very good player, Anderson, who's 30, and then Jorge Cuenca, who's 26. 2 decent players. Anderson's obviously been a good player for Fulham, and Bassey is a good player as well, but that's not a huge bit of cover for a centre back, especially if Arbeloa decides he wants to play with a back 3. And the interesting thing is the players that Fulham have been linked with and have signed so far is very much more or less attacking players across the board. So maybe people in Fulham, maybe Fulham have already decided this kid's good enough to be promoted to the first team and he can fill that spot in the squad. I'm not saying he's going to be starting for Fulham in the Premier League, but there's a scenario where he could very easily be a backup and then he works himself into that squad, man. So yeah, for sure. You're right. I mean, we never know. They might end up selling him. You never know. But he certainly proved himself in Belgium, and I wouldn't be surprised if he is on that in that Fulham first team this coming season for sure.
I mean, you make this point quite often on various shows that we're on together. He's an academy product of this, right? So selling him would be pure profit.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I didn't want to be cynical and point that out, but yeah, that's usually what happens.
Right. So that is not, I don't want to say that's something that speaks against him, because that could work out really well for him in his career. Being sold for a tidy sum that I think might be actually more than 5 million euros already could actually work out for him quite well too. But yeah, he's definitely, I think, a player on the up and one to watch, especially because he's from a country where a lot of clubs have commercial interests now, right? In North America, as clubs and leagues want to build in North America on the back of a World Cup, having a player who plays for one of those countries, for one of the 3 top nations in North America, is probably not a bad asset to have.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, I'll round up the segment by talking about my third and final player, and is a player close to my heart because he shares a nationality with me, and that is, of course, Gannon Doak, who is the Scottish winger at Bournemouth. People might remember that he recently made a move from Liverpool's youth academy to Bournemouth, and he didn't really get going last season. Bournemouth were obviously kind of in the ascendancy, doing very, very well. I think he was a wee bit knocked sideways in terms of development because of the very sudden and dramatic rise of Ryan, who kind of joined from, who's the Brazilian right winger, who went on to start for Brazil at the World Cup. So, you can't really argue with that. And then Junior Krupi as well, who's been, heralded as the next kind of Thierry Henry. So he's got a lot. He had those 2 players kind of overshadowing last season. However, it's worth bearing in mind that Bournemouth have kind of seen 2 wingers move on this summer in Hamad Traore and Sinestra. And I think, off the back of, I thought it was a very good World Cup for Gannon Doak. There's very, very few positives to talk about from Scotland at the World Cup. There's very, very few young players in that Scotland national team, let alone young players who thrived. And Gannon Doak was certainly one of them. He was happy going toe-to-toe with Brazilian defenders, Moroccan defenders, Haitian defenders. And I suspect Marco Rosa probably was watching on his couch during that, thinking, this guy might be quite useful for us going forward. So I just think in terms of opportunities, there's more space there for him at Bournemouth, but I also think Gannon Doak showed that World Cup that he's a very good young player. There's not really any speculation about him leaving the club this summer, which I think we would have known about by now if Bournemouth had no intentions of playing him this season. So, I think Gannon Doak certainly want to keep an eye on. And I should mention he is under 21. He's 20 years old with a market value of 15 million euros. So I suspect we'll see that number jump up because he can play on the left, he can play on the right, and I think he's going to be a very, very viable player for Bournemouth as they take on a number of competitions this season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really interesting player. Once again, someone that I don't think comes to mind right away. And I think we've done a really good job here, just thinking a little bit outside the box, Stefan, because Gannon Doak. I mean, Bournemouth is such an interesting club. I'm really curious to see how they're going to move on from the Iraola era to now the Marco Rose era, right? Very different managers in some respects too, in a club under US ownership that has done really well in kind of developing young players and really establishing themselves in the Premier League over the last few years. And I think it's becoming increasingly also a place where young players like to go to and, make that next step. And so I can really see him moving on because we don't know yet 100% sure what's happening with Ryan. If he's going to stay or not, right?
Yeah. Krupi too, he's been heavily linked with a number of clubs. So that front line could be very different in a month or so's time for sure.
Absolutely. So really fascinating.
If you guys want to take part, you guys can certainly let us know in the comments below who you think or which under 21 players you think will thrive this season. It's very easy to do so. You just go to Transfermarkt, click on Market Values at the top, head to Most Valuable Players, and you'll get to a list of all of the most valuable players in the world. And at the top, there's a filter for age, year, nationality, confederation, whatever you want to do. You only have to filter by under 21 age, and then just scroll down until you get to that price range. And let us know who you guys are picking or tipping to thrive at this season's World Cup. But Manu, one thing I did notice is we didn't mention a single French player in that segment. And that might be quite pertinent because France have got a new head coach, and we might see a number of young players coming through that national team. Did you like that segue there?
I love that. Yeah, it's very smart.
I'm getting better at this with every passing week. But yeah, let's now jump over to discuss Zinedine Zidane as the new French head coach with our colleagues on the French team at Transfermarkt.
And I'm now joined by Ronan Karoff, our area manager, Transfermarkt area manager in France. Ronan, how's it going? How is it over there in beautiful France?
It's fine here. Thanks for having me, Manu. It's great weather in France, and hopefully now we get a new era of French football with Zinedine Zidane announced as a French national team coach.
Yeah, I mean, that's why we have you on. We talked about Jürgen Klopp and his arrival to German football earlier in the show, and now we go. Of course, we're switching our attention to France. Very different circumstances, I would say, in terms of Zidane taking over his role versus Klopp taking over his role in Germany. Germany very much a rebuild. I can't think. I mean, obviously Spain are World Cup winners and European champions, but France have been in the top three or top four of the last three World Cups. I covered the tournament in 2018 when a young Kylian Mbappe led France to the World Cup title. They narrowly lose out in 2022 in that final, that chaotic final to Argentina. And then, of course, they lose to Spain in the semifinals and then lose the third place match to England, although I don't put much weight into that third place final, Ronan. I'm pretty sure that's pretty much
Neither.
Yeah, no one should. And it was a fantastic game to watch for the neutral. But, by far and large, Didier Deschamps had his critics, but it was a pretty successful era, wasn't it?
It's been going for, I think, 14 years, Deschamps in the French team, and it was coming after really tough years because we have the catastrophe in 2010, not going out of the World Cup group stage and the strike of the players in the bus. Then we got 4 years of a few years of Laurent Blanc, who was one of the old 1988 champions as a player and a successful coach with Bordeaux, but he didn't fully click. So it wasn't sure that we would climb that much under Deschamps' leadership, but he really managed to build something really impressive in this length as a national team coach, especially over a few generations, a few different cycles of World Cup and Euros. So, yeah, near the end, there's been a few, critics, and it was known for some time that it will be his last major competition. So I think French football as a whole had time to prepare to find the best way to work on the next stage, the next step, and find the best candidate.
I mean, I remember in 2014 when France went out in the quarterfinals to Germany in a very, tightly contested match. And I remember France going out and thinking this is going to be an amazing team over the next 12 years.
It was quite promising at the time. It was great mix of quite a few of the old guys of 2010, 2012, a few of them, but we had a younger Pogba, a younger Griezmann, this type of players who have been really pivotal to the success 4 years later in Russia and to some other great moments of the team. So it was only the beginning at the time, and really he laid the groundwork for years of great performances.
Yeah, absolutely did. Focusing now on Zidane. He had this really great success with Real Madrid, right? Looking at his profile now on Transfermarkt, the 3 Champions League titles stand out. I always joke that coaching Real Madrid is kind of like coaching a national team because you get all the best players in the world, you assemble them, and then, the coaches that are usually the most successful with Real Madrid are the ones that actually don't do that much coaching. They're the ones that sort of, the Carlo Ancelotti's, the Zinedine Zidane's, they walk in and their aura is so significant. Like, who am I to argue with who I think is one of the greatest football players I've ever seen play live in Zinedine Zidane? Who am I to argue with him? Even if you're like a Kylian Mbappe, right? Or Vinny Jr., you're not going to argue with Zinedine Zidane because what you have done with your career, he's done many times over. And so doing that at Real Madrid, I think in some really weird ways, almost perfectly sets him up for this France job now, because it's a very similar situation. This is one of the most talented teams in the world. I think ultimately the only reason they didn't win a World Cup is because maybe the midfield isn't as strong as Spain's. And games are usually right now in the game, the way it works right now is one in midfield. But this is still a team that if I would tip who's going to win the Euros, I would say France, Spain. Those are the 2 teams I would put my money on. And he now walks into this role with this massive aura. What do you think he's going to change?
Yeah, I was about to mention the term aura because I think he's really coming at the top of, like, he has proven himself time and time over, both as a player and a coach, and he's not even taking any risk. Like, I don't think he will destroy his reputation if France doesn't really click under him, but I think he might not change too much things at the start. Like the French team is a bit between generations. Like, I don't think there's so many players from the World Cup group that will exit the team at the nearest opportunity. Maybe a guy like N'Golo Kanté, or if they want to refresh a goalkeeper pool, maybe they get rid of Brice Samba, who is 33 or 34, I'm not sure, and bring out a guy like Robin Risser, who joined Newcastle, for example. Or at least he was still in the group as third goalkeeper of the World Cup, give him more opportunities. So yeah, I think we probably won't see too much new players called in the first months. Like we have the Nations League kicking back up in September and October. And I think it will probably be a rather stable group. Maybe a few younger players could be called for first time. I think about names like maybe Eli Kroupi, who had a first great season in Premier League, or maybe a guy like Adrien Truffert. It's actually 2 players from Bournemouth, but I think it's 2 players who showed great potential, have been coming out through various of the French youth national teams, and have proven themselves at a high level like the Premier League in not one of the biggest teams. So I think it shows the great prospect they can be for the French national team. And especially for a guy like Truffert, I think the type of players, like fullbacks in France has always been an ongoing topic. Like we have really been struggling to find the best options there. We have fine players like Malo Gusto, Lucas Dean, the Hernandez brothers, but it's not like they've been default choices, but they've never been like the biggest satisfactions of the roster. So I think that might be one of the main areas that he will try to focus to bring some new spirit, new strengths in that area of the French national team. But I think in terms of French depth, there's nothing to be scared of, but it's making the right choices or promoting the right newcomer at the right time. But it's he will have his options.
What do you think is going to change in terms of the style of play? Because I think what was really fascinating about this World Cup is that the attacking players were given much more freedom than it was maybe the case in the past.
Yeah.
And except for that game in Spain where, the Spanish are the Spanish, they're so ultimately in control. I was at the final against Argentina, and I thought it was really kind of scary how they dominated Argentina, and it was the same against France, right? So how do you I guess my question is, what do you think Zidane is going to do when he's looking at this France squad and saying, well, we have this juggernaut in Spain who don't really care much about attacking football. They just dominate you. How do you think he's going to approach and break the Spanish cycle?
Yeah, so that's one was mine of my main interrogations too, because I was checking again the previous rosters of Zidane. Like he used to play mainly in a 4-3-3 with Real Madrid, compared to the last few games of the French national team with Deschamps, who got really used to a 4-2-3-1. So, for example, if he has to play with a different number of midfielders that he was used to at Real Madrid, at least it keeps the fact of like only one striker and two wingers. So I think this type of things he can quickly adapt on. But I think mainly the midfielder topic will be a huge one for him, because it's one of the most crowded areas in terms of talent in French football, and it's the one when he might have less options that he would usually have in the type of playing style he used at Real Madrid. So I think most of the typical roster of France might not move, especially in the attack with Dembele, Mbappe. Maybe guy like Cherki could play a bit more than he did under Deschamps. But like for midfield, with at least for French observers, we were rather pleased with Chouameni and quite a revelation of Manu Kone, who had a great couple of games while Chouameni was injured. And guys like Rabiot, who have still been really reliable. So it's quite unsure yet of which type of players he will prefer to use, because for now we haven't really heard him of which are his preferred players. I think now from the time he had at Real Madrid, there's not much players that have been under his rule at Real Madrid that is still eligible for the French team. So I don't think he has any major preferences. Like he hasn't made any. We don't really know like his favorite players or anything. Like he hasn't made it that known in media or anything. So yeah, a bit of doubt around that.
I guess like my final question really to you is then, before we let you go into your much deserved end of the day, Ronan, is N'Golo Kanté. He seemed to be the one that France has not been able to replace. You know, he was still in the squad, right? Even though he plays in Saudi. And when I look the way where he played when he was at his most dominant, controlling midfield and controlling play, I can't really see anyone like that for France at the moment. Is that maybe the biggest weakness? You mentioned the fullbacks as well, but is that the biggest weakness at the moment, that they just don't have an N'Golo Kanté?
That's a great point, actually, because in some way we could point to the quality of the French midfield, but it's kind of lacking like a clear leader, like Kanté was, or Pogba could be at times. Like we don't have this type of players. Like Chouameni hasn't really risen to this occasion to be really the top midfielder of the team, or a guy like Camavinga has even been left out of the World Cup roster. So there's kind of a gap to find a clear leader. While we have a lot of players in this type of clear best years, typically of their career around 25, 26 years old, like Manu Kone, Chouameni, Boubacar Kamara from Aston Villa, Matteo Guendouzi wasn't at the World Cup either, but could maybe make a comeback, or this type of players who hasn't really proven themselves to be this type of leader yet. So either Zinedine Zidane puts trust into them and kind of transforms the impact they could have on the pitch, or either we wait on the rise of young talent that hasn't really shown himself yet in the national team. Maybe a guy like Yirenkyi, he's been here for years, but he's only 20 years old, so there's still a lot of potential to dig in. Or guys like Mayulu from PSG also, or a few other youngsters that haven't got a senior call with the national team, but could be probably interesting in a couple years. I think we need this type of really leader of the midfield who could really dictate the pace of a game, like we've seen in games of France during this World Cup, that the game sometimes took really not a lot of time to go forward, like only on the wings, a lot of direct movement. the game didn't really wait on Rabiot, Tchouaméni, Kone to really build the game pass by pass. So I think it, in a way that could expose, depending on the type of playing style that Zidane will go for the team, it's also depends on the type of midfield he will need, or the type of attitude he will need for that lead midfielder. So I think there's a few options that could get an opportunity to prove that it could be the new Kanté in a way, but there's not like a clear favorite that seems like it's clear that this guy is the new Kanté. Like there's not this type of label yet. So I hope we get this maybe. I would personally hope a guy like Zaire could be this type of player. Like he's been quite promising on a few positions, like at least like for PSG during the past season. He's been even a substitute to Achraf Hakimi on the wing when he was away. So, and like he's had a full season. He's a back-to-back Champions League winner. So I think this type of players that could take the next step of his career, especially in the national team, to get this type of opportunity under a new coach.
You know, if anyone can find the next N'Golo Kanté or Zinedine Zidane, it will be Zinedine Zidane. So I think France is just going to be in very good hands. Ronan, thank you so much for joining today. Enjoy the rest of your day. And guys, we're going to move back now to the main show. Cheers. Bye-bye.
And we are back. Now, we've discussed Zidane in France. So now we're going to discuss Jürgen Klopp in Germany. Like I said at the top of the podcast, some big managerial changes in the international game. And as users, as listeners may be able to tell, even though Manu is our area manager for the United States, he does have a distinct accent. And he is, in fact, German. And not only that, he
born
watched
in Germany.
Born in Germany. It depends where he is in the world, how he defines himself. But he did, of course, take in most. I think. Did you watch? Were you at all of Germany's games at World Cup?
Not all of them. Most of them.
Yeah.
I missed one. The one that was the biggest disaster.
Convenient for sure.
It was not my fault.
Well, yes, disaster is certainly the word for it in terms of the World Cup. And as a result, Julian Nagelsmann was relieved of his duties as the Bundestrainer, as they call him in Germany. And on Friday, Jürgen Klopp was announced as his successor. Manu, this isn't really a market values topic. We can't really talk about market values. I can tell you, at least I could tell you before I closed the tab, but I think if I'm not mistaken, Germany had the 5th most valuable group of players at the World Cup. I've got it in front of me here. Yes, it was number 5. My memory hasn't deserted me just yet. Just ahead of Brazil and Argentina, below Portugal, Spain, England, and France. So on paper, Germany have the talent to work, but obviously the German FA have, called in the big guns. You don't get much bigger really than Jürgen Klopp, to be honest. Although I did see some speculative reporting that Pep Guardiola might end up at Italy. So we'll see if Italy can outdo the Germans in that regard. But anyway, We're here to talk about Germany, we're here to talk about Klopp. What's your initial reaction to Klopp becoming the new German head coach?
Yeah, very positive. I think he brings he brings the right personality to the job. I think Julian Nagelsmann, especially towards the end, the lack of life experience showed in terms of the magnitude of position he was in, right? In Germany, the Bundestrainer is right next to the Bundeskanzler, the Chancellor, who's not the head of state, but governs. And you could tell that Nagelsmann wasn't 100% cut out for that role towards the end. And Jürgen Klopp, he's such a massive personality. He might be the most famous German in the world at the moment. I live in North America, and he is an ads here. That tells you everything that you need to know about him. And you mentioned, in market values, I think, Germany's squad is the 5th or 6th most valuable in the world. And I think rightfully so. The problem is that it doesn't have a balanced squad, right? The value is concentrated in very few positions. And that was also evident at this tournament that, there's specialty position and roles are missing. And Nagelsmann also blamed for playing players outside their roles and weakening the squad as a result. And also leaving some of these most valuable players at home. We were talking about U21 players earlier. The four most valuable U21 players that Germany have were all not at the tournament. That's Lennart Karl, Said Almala, Tom Bischoff, Finn Jeltsch. That's the future of Germany. They were all not there. The fifth most valuable, Asano Drago, was there, but he shares the same market value as Karim Koulibaly, who wasn't there, right? So there's a lot to work with for Jürgen Klopp in terms of bringing in fresh young players and maybe being more proactive in doing so than Julian Nagelsmann was.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually just about to kind of bring that up. You've kind of stole my thunder a little bit there because I'm looking at the list of the most valuable German players, and it is a surprisingly youthful list. Obviously, when you look at like France at this World Cup, you've got so many kind of senior world-class players, Dembele, Kylian Mbappe, okay, Ossie's a little younger, but that midfield, that defense is full of much older players, to be sure. Argentina, obviously a number of kind of senior players, not just Lionel Messi, who's obviously pushing 40 now, but yeah, you look at the kind of list of the most valuable German players. You got Musiala and Wirtz, both on 100 million euros, 23 years old. Pavlovic, 22, 90 million euros. As you said, Leonard Carr, 60 million euros. Kai Havertz is the outlier, and he's only 27. And if you wanted to kind of discuss actual minutes in his legs, if you want, over the course of his career, a lot of people say he's only just getting going because obviously injury has held him back recently. And then you got guys like Mecha, Voldemada, Bissek, and Nathaniel Brown, who's obviously just moved to Bayern Munich. So it is a catalogue of young players there. And as you said, a number of those players haven't even really picked up a number of caps for Germany. So, it's interesting that when Hansi Flick left the German national team and Nagelsmann was brought in, there was this kind of hope, I think, that he was going to usher in this great change. And whereas Flick had been this almost unexpected continuation of Jogi Löw's tenure at the national team and stuck with those players, there was a hope that Nagelsmann was going to be the guy to kind of make that big change. And it didn't really happen, did it? Because he stuck with the guys like Manuel Neuer and Kimmich, and no offense to Kimmich, obviously, and it was by and large a much older squad. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, at the Euros, I think they actually had one of the oldest squads at the competition, which was Nagelsmann's first competition, and I think they also had one of the oldest squads at this World Cup as well. So, do we think Klopp has been chosen because he, whether at Dortmund, at Mainz, which we can't forget, of course, and at Liverpool, he's never really shied away from throwing young players into the deep end?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a big part of it. And he has the players to work with, right? There is a lot of doom and gloom about German football, and there's a tendency to think we have to completely reinvent the wheel here. And I've said this on a number of shows. The youth teams and the German youth teams are actually performing quite well. They're performing a lot better than the senior national team is. And we're talking about like the same level as Spain. That's the only youth team that is sort of outdoing them. We've seen it at the summer's tournaments at U19 level, for example. So the players are there, and for some odd reason, Nagelsmann had no interest in integrating them. And I think a big part of what Jürgen Klopp is now going to do is that's going to change. And he said that as much, he had plenty of television opportunities this summer to undermine Julian Nagelsmann's role as a head coach and say how he would do things differently. And I think now he has to put it, the money where his mouth was. He has to now show that he can actually integrate all these young guys because they're there. This isn't as bad of a generation as people think. It's just a matter of actually playing these kids.
Yeah, absolutely. On Klopp, before maybe wrap up here, he's 59. I think people forget how old he is because he has brand new teeth and the hair and the tan, and he looks so energetic. But, he's at an age where a lot of people are starting to think about retirement. I know some football coaches simply can't retire and they obviously go into their 70s and 80s, but when he left Liverpool, he very much gave the impression that he wasn't rushing into a new job. He obviously took on that role at Red Bull, which I challenge anyone to properly define, to be honest with you. But anyway, that's not really the discussion we're having here. And despite constant speculation linking him to, Real Madrid and other big clubs, it never really seemed likely. He's now taking this role with Germany. Do you think this might be his last big managerial role? Do you think he's thinking, well, this will see me through to when I can hang up I don't know what managers do when they're tired. Did they hang up their tactics board? I don't know, their chalk. Who knows?
The whistle or whatever they use. Yeah, the contract was till 2030, right? That's in 4 years. Stefan, I can tell you one thing for certain. When I'm 63, I'm no longer working. And if I do, take me out back and shoot me. But the thing is, there's an interview on our site, Transfermarkt, right? I spoke to Jürgen Klopp. It was a small group of journalists, and that had an opportunity to speak to him one-on-one for over an hour. It's a very long time to talk to him in person. And I got the impression then that while he enjoyed his semi-retired life at Leipzig, that he was willing to take on a role that wasn't a club role. He emphatically said that he wasn't going to do that. Real Madrid, for example, was rumored at the time. He said, no, absolutely not. But I walked away from that thinking, does this fulfill him? Probably not. And the national team it's a specified role with a specified task where you do the coaching that he loves. I think he still loves the coaching, but it's not the full-on club role. It's a nice compromise where he can be what he thinks he can do best. I don't see him as an administrator, which was the role he had at Leipzig. Sorry, Red Bull, before I get a call here. But I didn't see that as his best role. He's a coach. And now he gets to do that with Germany, but he doesn't have the stress of doing it every single day.
Yeah, exactly. I think you probably hit the nail on the head in that regard, because obviously international football is so much, well, it's not so much slower, but it certainly is slower than club football. And, you might, he might have found, as you said, that he took on that Red Bull role. Sorry, that's a bit of a tongue twister for me. Thinking it would be a kind of part-time job, but all of a sudden he's having to oversee and appoint head coaches in Japan and then Brazil, and then he's flying to Germany, and then there's obviously Red Bull have their finger in a number of pies across the world of football. So maybe he's thinking, I'll take on this German national team job, and I might actually be able to put my feet up from time to time. But in terms of that, though, man, in terms of like the expectation on him, do you think? I do wonder if many of the ways that Nagelsmann didn't work out, and as we just touched on there, he ended up falling back on a lot of the kind of senior players and more or less begging Manuel Neuer not to retire and come back for one kind of final hooray. It felt to me like Nagelsmann maybe really struggled with the expectations placed on him, and he ultimately made a lot of compromises to try and get short-term success where maybe he should be focused on long-term progress. Do we think Klopp is maybe a little more immune to that just because of his personality, just because of, his perceived, well, not his perceived, but his undoubted success at both Dortmund and Liverpool, and he can walk into the German FA and say, well, look, I'm in charge. I'm the boss here, and if I need to work for 2 years to build a squad, then that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, I think, I'll give you a good example. I think the writing was on the wall that Germany wasn't going to win in North America this summer. Because even if they had gone past Paraguay, they would have gone out against France. France is just better at the moment, right? So I think if Jürgen Klopp had been in charge, that would have been a much younger team at the tournament. And I think he's going to look at the Euros now in 2028, which are in the United Kingdom, right? And he's going to say, okay, that's a tournament that with a young team, we're not necessarily going to win, but we can maybe do a lot more than we did at this World Cup, especially if we bring in all these young guys that we just mentioned here, right? With a lot more energy. And then there's no expectation to win the tournament. And that can set us up really nicely for 2030 when we have probably a 64-team tournament in Spain, Portugal, Morocco, Uruguay, Argentina, and Paraguay.
A truly World Cup.
Truly World Cup. But, I think that is really the goal here, right? And 4 years is a long time in football. You might be all doom and gloom about this team now. In 4 years, this might be a completely different perspective. And so 2 years is a short time. 4 years is a lifetime in professional football. And I think he is going to have a far better understanding of what needs to be done in terms of setting this up. Not think as short term, because Julian Nagelsmann went into the World Cup saying, we have to win this now because 2 years ago I said we would, right? And then try to send a squad there that was really just designed to win a tournament, and to get there he cut corners. I don't think Jürgen Klopp would do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, whether it's Klopp at Germany, Zidane at France, or the 6 under-21 players, which we talked about earlier in the show, we have given you, dear listener, plenty of things to look forward to in the near and long-term future. So I hope you've enjoyed this week's show. As ever, we really appreciate if you guys could give us a rating and a review on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, whatever you guys want to do. Share with your friends and let us know what you think of the show. Feedback is always appreciated. But until next week, we'll speak soon, and see you then.